A storm brewing in the park. A quiet morning, a gentle breeze, and a brewing storm. The local park was serene that morning, bathed in the soft golden glow of the rising sun. The air carried the scent of fresh grass, and birds chirped in lively chorus, their melodies weaving seamlessly with the laughter of children playing on the swings. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, whispering secrets to the world as families spread picnic blankets on the grass and joggers moved in rhythmic strides, lost in their own thoughts. Among them sat Aaliyah, a young girl with an infectious smile, her wheelchair positioned under the shade of a towering oak tree. The wheelchair, painted a brilliant purple and adorned with stickers of butterflies and stars, reflected her vibrant spirit. Despite everything life had thrown at her, Aaliyah had never let it dim her light. Her father, Marcus, sat on a nearby bench, a travel mug of coffee in hand, his gaze never straying too far from his daughter. He wasn't just watching her, he was protecting her. Aaliyah was his world, and every moment spent with her was a treasure. Being a single father had never been easy, but seeing her smile made every struggle worth it. Aaliyah hummed softly as she adjusted the scarf around her neck, a colorful gift from her grandmother. It was bright, bold, and impossible to ignore, much like her personality. She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling as she watched children playing tag nearby, their feet kicking up bits of grass. She loved the way they moved, so free, so full of life. She didn't envy them. Instead, she found joy in simply watching, in absorbing the energy they radiated. Life, she had learned, wasn't about what you couldn't do, but about making the most of what you could. Yet, this peaceful morning was about to take a sharp, jarring turn. The unseen threat approaches. At the edge of the park, a man strode down the path, his posture stiff, his expression sour. His name was Ethan Carter, a man in his late 30s whose face was set in a permanent scowl. Life had been unkind to him. His business had failed, his relationships were in ruins, and every morning he woke up feeling like the world had conspired against him. But instead of confronting his own shortcomings, he carried his bitterness like a shield, lashing out at anything that reminded him of his failures. Today, his anger was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Every smile, every sound of laughter, every display of happiness around him felt like a personal insult. And then, he saw her. A little girl, sitting there in her wheelchair, smiling like she had no right to. His lips curled into a sneer. Weak. Useless. People like her just take up space. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. But anger rarely is. Ethan slowed his steps, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't know this girl, but in that moment, he despised her existence. He despised what she represented, a reminder that life wasn't fair. And somehow his twisted mind convinced him that she was part of the problem. Marcus noticed Ethan before Aaliyah did. Years of being a single father had honed his instincts. He could sense trouble before it even arrived. And right now, his instincts were screaming. Ethan's body language, the way he stopped a few feet away from Aaliyah, the sneer on his face, it all screamed of hostility. Marcus set down his coffee, his muscles tensing as he prepared to intervene. A tense confrontation. Ethan took another step closer, his voice cut through the crisp morning air, laced with venom. "What are you doing here?" Aaliyah looked up, startled. The squirrel she had been watching scurry up a tree forgotten in an instant. She blinked. "I'm just enjoying the park," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ethan's scowl deepened. "This park is for people who belong here. You think you're special, sitting there like that, taking up space." Aaliyah's smile faltered. Her hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. What does he mean? She thought, confusion mixing with unease. Marcus was already moving, his long strides carrying him toward his daughter. Not yet, he told himself. He needed to hear more. He needed to see how far Ethan was willing to go. Aaliyah swallowed, but her voice remained firm. "I'm not bothering anyone." Ethan let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Bothering? No, but people like you just take. What do you even contribute, huh? Sitting there, waiting for people to feel sorry for you. A few heads turned. Some joggers slowed their pace, uncertain whether to intervene or not. Aaliyah's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, to fight back. But how do you argue with pure hatred? Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. You're just a burden. Ethan's voice was loud now, his words cutting like knives. The air around them felt heavy, charged with tension. And then, Marcus was there. A father's wrath. That's enough. The deep, steady voice of Marcus Walker cut through the park like a blade. Ethan turned, startled. Marcus stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. The father in him, the man who had fought tooth and nail to give his daughter the best life possible, had heard enough. Ethan scoffed, trying to recover his composure. And who the hell are you? I'm her father. Marcus's tone was calm, deadly calm. And I suggest you walk away. Ethan laughed, but it was hollow, forced. Oh, her father. Well, maybe you should teach her where she belongs. People like her, people like you, don't get to tell me what to do. Marcus took a step forward. The air shifted. The crowd that had been watching from a distance grew silent, sensing that something important, something bigger than just an argument, was happening before them. Ethan's confidence wavered. Why isn't he backing down? Why does he look at me like that? Like I'm nothing. For the first time, doubt flickered in Ethan's eyes. You don't know anything about my daughter, Marcus said, his voice steady. But I promise you this, you will not hurt her. Ethan clenched his fists, but he could feel the tide turning. He could see the foams being raised. He could hear the whispers. He could sense the weight of the moment crushing down on him. The once serene park was now a battlefield of ideologies, a clash of hate against love, of weakness against true strength. And Ethan was beginning to realize he had already lost. The breaking point. Tension in the air. Ethan stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides as if holding on to the last threads of his anger. But something had changed. The momentum had shifted, and he could feel it. The once indifferent crowd was no longer turning a blind eye. They were watching. They were listening. Some held phones up, recording everything. Others murmured among themselves, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to silent judgment. Ethan swallowed hard. He had expected compliance, weakness, submission. Instead, he was staring into the eyes of a man who refused to back down. Marcus stood his ground, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. But there was a storm brewing beneath the surface, a quiet yet overwhelming force, far more powerful than Ethan's loud hostility. Beside him, Aaliyah gripped the arms of her broken wheelchair, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her father's presence had given her strength. She was still angry. She was still hurt. But most of all, she was determined. Ethan's lips curled into a sneer, desperate to regain control. You think you scare me? He spat. Marcus didn't blink. His silence was louder than any insult. Ethan felt the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. He couldn't back down. Not now. He stepped closer. Too close. And then, he did something unforgivable. The unthinkable act. With a sharp kick, Ethan stomped down onto the frame of Aaliyah's wheelchair. A loud metallic crack echoed through the park as the delicate structure buckled under the force. Aaliyah gasped. Her world tilted. Her balance shifted as the left wheel collapsed inward, sending her sprawling to the ground with a sharp thud. For a single, agonizing second, the park fell into dead silence. Marcus saw red. His hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. But before he could react, before the storm inside him could erupt, a sound shattered the moment. Aaliyah's laughter. A laugh that cut deeper than any words. Not the kind of joyous, carefree laughter that had once filled the park. No, this was different. It was sharp, bitter. It was a sound far too heavy for a girl her age. She looked up at Ethan, tears glistening in her eyes. But she wasn't crying. She was smiling. "You really think breaking my wheelchair makes you strong?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Ethan stared at her, caught off guard. Marcus was silent, his entire body vibrating with barely restrained fury. Aaliyah lifted herself up, slowly, painfully, but with a defiance that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You're just sad." She tilted her head, her gaze boring into him like a scalpel slicing through his facade. "You want to make me feel weak. But I'm not. You are." Ethan's breath hitched. He hadn't expected this. He had expected tears. He had expected fear. But instead, a child, a girl in a wheelchair, was looking at him like he was nothing, like she pitied him. Something inside him cracked. The crowd, now fully against him, began murmuring louder. Someone yelled from the distance, "What's wrong with you?" Another voice joined. "That's a child, you monster." Ethan took a staggered step back. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions. And then, it got worse. A father's wrath. Marcus moved faster than Ethan could react. Not with violence, not with fury, but with purpose. He stepped forward, his massive frame towering over Ethan's shrinking form. His voice, low, controlled, lethal, cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "Pick it up." Ethan blinked. "Do you what?" Marcus pointed at the shattered wheelchair, his expression stone cold. "Pick it up." Ethan let out a hollow laugh, attempting to regain his footing. "Or what? You gonna hit me?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "No. I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what kind of person you are." The weight of the crowd's judgment pressed down on Ethan like an unrelenting storm. He had gone too far. Even he couldn't justify this anymore. Hands trembling, he bent down and grabbed the broken wheelchair. It was still warm from where Aaliyah had been sitting, the cracked stickers peeling from the metal frame. For a moment, his throat tightened. What have I done? He could feel every pair of eyes burning into him. The judgment, the disgust, and for the first time in years, shame. The moment that changed everything. Marcus knelt beside Aaliyah, his voice suddenly gentle. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" She shook her head, but her hands were still trembling. Marcus turned his gaze back to Ethan. "You're going to fix this." Ethan stiffened. "I'd what?" "You're going to buy her a new wheelchair. Today." Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The crowd was watching, waiting. There was no way out. With a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "I'll pay for it." Marcus didn't thank him. He didn't smile. He just stared. "Good, because this isn't about the wheelchair." Ethan hesitated. "Then what is it about?" Marcus's expression remained unreadable, but his voice, calm and unwavering, held a depth Ethan wasn't prepared for. "It's about what kind of man you want to be when you walk away from here." Ethan swallowed. And for the first time in his life, he had no answer. The weight of consequences. The world was watching. Ethan stood there, his fists clenched, his face flushed with humiliation. For the first time in years, he felt small. The weight of judgment pressed down on him from every direction, not just from Marcus, not just from Aaliyah, but from everyone in the park. Dozens of eyes bore into him, some filled with anger, some with disgust, but worst of all, some with pity. He had always been the one looking down on others, but now he was the one being looked down upon. The shattered wheelchair was still in his hands, its broken frame a symbol of what he had done. And Marcus, unshaken, unmoving, stared at him like a mirror reflecting every ugly part of himself. Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. He swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. "I said I'd pay for it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But Marcus wasn't done yet. "That's not enough," Marcus said. "Fixing a wheelchair won't fix what you did." Ethan scoffed, desperate to find control again. "What do you want? A public apology? Some grand speech?" Marcus didn't even blink. "No, I want you to understand what you tried to take away from my daughter." Ethan stiffened. "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice quiet, but dangerous. "It means you're coming with me. Right now. You're going to buy a new wheelchair, and you're going to bring it to her yourself. And if you think that's where this ends, you're wrong." Ethan frowned, a mix of defensiveness and confusion flashing across his face. "You think you can force me?" Marcus didn't break his stare. "You're free to walk away," he said simply. "But if you do, you'll always be the coward who picked on a child and ran away when it was time to make it right. And trust me." He glanced at the crowd, where at least a dozen phones were still pointed at Ethan. "The world will remember." Ethan felt his stomach twist. He looked around and saw the silent, waiting faces. Some of them already had their minds made up about him. Others were watching, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do. An unexpected journey. 30 minutes later, Ethan was sitting in the passenger seat of Marcus's car. Aaliyah was in the back, her arms crossed, still staring at Ethan like he was a stain on the world. Ethan had agreed to go, not because Marcus had forced him, but because the alternative felt worse. He wasn't sure why he was here. He wasn't sure what it would change. But for some reason, he didn't fight it. The ride was silent. The tension was suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the road beneath the tires and the occasional sniffle from Aaliyah, who still hadn't spoken to him. Ethan glanced at Marcus. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the wheel firmly but controlled. This was a man who had been through things, a man who had fought battles Ethan couldn't even imagine. And he had won. Ethan had spent years thinking he was strong. But next to Marcus, he felt like a child. The wheelchair store. They pulled into a small medical supply store, and Marcus parked the car. "We're here," Marcus said. Aaliyah didn't move. Ethan didn't either. Marcus turned to him. "Go inside. Pick the best one they have. Money isn't an excuse." Ethan hesitated. Marcus's voice hardened. "Do it." Ethan swallowed. Then, with stiff movements, he stepped out of the car. The store was bright and sterile, rows of wheelchairs and mobility aids neatly lined up. Ethan stood there, unsure of what to do. A store clerk approached. "Can I help you, sir?" Ethan opened his mouth, but for a second, no words came out. He had never done something like this before. He had never even thought about what it meant to need a wheelchair. Now he had to choose one for the girl he had just humiliated. A pit formed in his stomach. "I need a wheelchair," he said slowly. "For a kid. A girl. She's 10. The clerk smiled warmly, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. "Of course. We have a lot of great options for younger users. Do you want something sporty? Something custom-colored?" Ethan hesitated. Something custom. Something personal. He thought of Aaliyah's old wheelchair, the one he had broken. The butterflies. The stars. The purple paint. And something inside him twisted painfully. "Yeah," he said, his voice strangely quiet. "Purple. And, butterflies. And stars." The clerk beamed. "Great choice." Ethan forced a nod. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't name. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something worse. Delivering redemption. When Ethan walked out with the new wheelchair, Aaliyah's eyes widened slightly. It wasn't just any wheelchair. It was beautiful. The rich purple paint gleamed under the sunlight. The wheels had tiny silver stars painted onto them, and the backrest had an intricate butterfly design etched in gold. It was better than her old one. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes unreadable. "Give it to her yourself," he said. Ethan's stomach turned to lead. He hesitated. Then, with slow, heavy steps, he knelt in front of Aaliyah. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not as a burden, not as a reminder of his own failures, but as a person. Ethan swallowed. His voice felt small. "I'm sorry." Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment. And then, in a quiet, steady voice, she said, "I forgive you." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't deserve that. But she gave it anyway. And somehow, that made it worse. A new beginning. As they drove back to the park, Ethan didn't speak. Marcus didn't either. But Aaliyah smiled. Not at Ethan. Not at what had happened. But at what was about to happen. Because this wasn't just about a wheelchair. This was about change. And for the first time ever, Ethan Carter felt the weight of what that truly meant. The ripple effect. A heavy silence. The drive back to the park was silent. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing. The weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. He had never expected to feel this uneasiness, this guilt, this twisting in his gut that refused to settle. Marcus drove with the same calm, steady demeanor, his hands firm on the wheel. He hadn't spoken since they left the wheelchair store, and somehow, that was worse than anything he could have said. Aaliyah, now sitting in her beautiful new wheelchair, ran her hands over the butterflies and stars. She hadn't thanked him. She hadn't smiled at him. And yet, she had forgiven him. That alone gnawed at him. Why? Why would she do that? People like him didn't deserve forgiveness. He knew that. Deep down, he had known it for a long time. The weight of his past. As they pulled into the parking lot near the park, Ethan inhaled deeply, bracing himself for the crowd. Would they still be watching? Still judging? As he stepped out, he felt the eyes on him. But now, they weren't just filled with disgust. Some of them were curious. Some were hesitant. Some skeptical, but waiting. Ethan felt an uncomfortable heat rise in his chest. Was this what it felt like to be on the other side of things? Was this what it felt like to be seen as the villain? As Marcus helped Aaliyah out of the car, Ethan turned his gaze to the park, his mind drifting. There was a reason why he had reacted so strongly when he saw Aaliyah in that wheelchair. A reason why seeing someone like her, happy despite her struggles, had angered him so much. Because deep down, he had been angry at himself, at his own weakness, at his own failures, and most of all, at the father he once had. A ghost from the past. Ethan had been a boy once, a scrawny, awkward kid with a stutter and a love for building things. And his father, a man who had never once believed in him. "You're worthless, Ethan. You think anyone cares about your stupid little projects. Stop embarrassing me." Words that had been drilled into his mind for years. Words that had shaped him into the bitter, angry man he was today. He had never fought back. He had never stood up for himself. And when he grew older, instead of breaking the cycle, he became just like him. A bully. Not because he wanted to be, but because hurting others was easier than facing the truth. And now he was standing in a park, staring at a little girl who had more strength than he had ever known. And it made him sick. Not because of her, but because he finally saw himself for what he really was. A coward. A father's challenge. Marcus suddenly spoke, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. "You think this is over?" Ethan turned, frowning. "What?" Marcus folded his arms, his sharp gaze pinning Ethan in place. "You bought the wheelchair," he said. "That's good, but that doesn't make you a better person." Ethan stiffened. Marcus took a step closer. "What happens next, Ethan?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "What do you mean?" Marcus's voice was low, but firm. "You think one good deed erases everything you've done." He shook his head. "That's not how it works." Ethan felt his stomach twist. You want me to grovel? Beg? He snapped, his old anger rising like a reflex. Marcus didn't flinch. No. I want you to change. Ethan froze. Marcus crossed his arms. You say life has been hard on you, he continued. Maybe it has. But the truth is, Ethan, you're not a victim. You're a man who made choices, and those choices hurt people. Ethan clenched his jaw. And what do you expect me to do about that? Marcus's gaze hardened. You tell me. Ethan looked away. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. Aaliyah's words. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Aaliyah spoke. I think you should come back. Ethan frowned, turning to her. Come back. She nodded. To the park. Every week. And help people. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. I don't think people want me here, kid. Aaliyah tilted her head, then proved them wrong. Ethan's breath hitched. That was not the answer he had expected. Why? He asked, voice raw. Why do you even care? Aaliyah looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her that made his chest ache. Not pity, not forgiveness, but hope. Because I don't think you really want to be this person, she said softly. Ethan's throat tightened. She was wrong. She had to be. Because if she was right, then that meant he had wasted years of his life being someone he didn't have to be. And that was a truth too painful to face. A decision that could change everything. Marcus finally broke the silence. She's giving you a chance, Ethan. One that most people wouldn't. Ethan's hands curled into fists. And if I say no? Marcus shrugged. Then you walk away. And you live with that choice. Ethan looked at Aaliyah. At Marcus. At the park, filled with families and laughter and light. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A chance. A chance to be more. A chance to be better. He swallowed. And then, for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter made a different choice. Fine, he muttered. I'll come back. Aaliyah grinned. Marcus gave a small, approving nod. And for the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. The road to redemption. A heavy step forward. Ethan didn't know why he said yes. Maybe it was Aaliyah's unwavering gaze. Maybe it was Marcus's quiet, steady strength. Or maybe, for the first time in his life, he was tired of being the person he had become. But the moment the words left his mouth, the weight in his chest shifted, not gone, but different. Aaliyah gave him a small smile, as if she had always known he would say yes. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. You start tomorrow. Ethan blinked. Tomorrow. Marcus didn't budge. If you're serious, you don't wait. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You're really not gonna make this easy, huh? Marcus's face was unreadable. Why should it be easy? Ethan had no response. Because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. A community divided. The next day, Ethan Carter returned to the park. And the moment people saw him, the reaction was immediate. Parents stiffened, pulling their children closer. Joggers who had smiled at Marcus and Aaliyah the day before now glared at Ethan with wary suspicion. A woman near the playground whispered something to her husband, who turned to stare at Ethan like he was a criminal. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Of course, they didn't trust him. Why would they? To them, he was still the man who had bullied a child. The man who had broken a wheelchair in a fit of anger. The man who had spread hate instead of kindness. But Ethan had made a promise. And for once in his life, he intended to keep it. Marcus was already there, leaning against a bench as he watched Ethan approach. Aaliyah was by his side, her purple wheelchair gleaming in the morning sun. Ethan swallowed hard. It was still surreal to see her sitting in the very thing he had destroyed. Marcus didn't say anything. He simply handed Ethan a broom. Ethan frowned. What's this for? Marcus raised a brow. You're here to help. Start by cleaning. Ethan scoffed. You're kidding. Marcus didn't blink. No. Ethan looked at the broom, then at the trash littering the park. Fallen leaves, food wrappers, crumpled napkins. He glanced at the watching eyes around him, waiting for him to storm off, to prove that he wasn't really here to change. And suddenly, that old, familiar stubbornness kicked in. Without another word, he took the broom and started sweeping, earning trust the hard way. For the next 2 hours, Ethan worked in silence. He picked up trash. He straightened benches. He wiped down playground equipment. All while under the watchful eyes of the very people who had witnessed his worst moment. He could feel their judgment. And yet, no one stopped him. A few even whispered among themselves, glancing at Marcus as if to ask, "Is this real?" Marcus remained calm, observing, waiting. Aaliyah, however, was not so quiet. "You missed a spot," she teased as he wiped down a slide. Ethan shot her a look. "You got a list of complaints, kid." She grinned. "Yep. Want me to write them down?" Despite himself, Ethan chuckled. It was small, barely there. But Marcus noticed it, and for the first time since meeting Ethan, he saw something new. A spark of something human. A moment of hesitation. As the hours passed, something strange happened. People stopped glaring as much. A few joggers nodded slightly as they passed, not quite friendly, but not outright hostile. Even the woman who had whispered about him earlier now watched in quiet curiosity. Ethan felt the change. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a start. And yet, doubt still clung to him like a shadow. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan sat on a bench, rubbing his aching hands. Marcus sat beside him, silent. After a while, Ethan finally muttered, "You really think this'll change anything?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "That depends." Ethan glanced at him. "On what?" Marcus met his gaze. "On whether you're doing this to prove something to me, or to yourself." Ethan felt something inside him tighten. Because he didn't have an answer. An unlikely conversation. As Ethan walked toward the parking lot, he heard a voice behind him. "Wait." He turned to see Aaliyah wheeling toward him. She stopped in front of him, tilting her head. "You gonna be here tomorrow?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah." Aaliyah grinned. "Good, because you're still not very good at sweeping." Ethan let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Then, after a moment, he frowned. "Why are you being nice to me?" Aaliyah blinked, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you're trying." Ethan stared at her. Then, with a quiet nod, he turned and walked away. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the same man who had walked into that park the day before. The breaking point. A test of will. Ethan had never felt so out of place in his own skin. It had been 4 days since he started working at the park, and every day felt like a silent battle. He woke up, got in his car, and forced himself to show up, sweeping sidewalks, picking up trash, scrubbing benches, all under the judgmental stares of strangers. Some of them still whispered when he walked by. Some still crossed the park just to avoid him. And worst of all, some children flinched when they saw him. That stung the most, because once upon a time, he had been one of those kids, terrified of the men who raised their voices first and their fists second. And now he was one of them. At least, he had been. The question was, could he ever be anything else? The tipping point. By day 5, Ethan was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. He had expected that earning back trust would be hard, but he hadn't expected it to feel this suffocating. No matter how much he tried, there were still people who would never forgive him. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't deserve forgiveness. Maybe. "Excuse me." Ethan blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. A woman stood before him. A tall, sharp-eyed mother with 2 small kids clinging to her side. He immediately recognized her. She had been there the day of the incident. She had recorded everything on her phone. And right now, she was glaring at him like she wanted to throw him out of the park herself. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, arms crossed. Ethan hesitated. "I'm helping." Marcus's voice cut in from behind him. The woman turned sharply. "Helping," she repeated. "You really think a few hours of cleaning makes up for what he did?" The words hit Ethan like a slap. Marcus didn't flinch. "No, but it's a start." The woman scoffed, looking Ethan up and down with clear disdain. "You're lucky no one pressed charges," she said bitterly. "If it were up to me, you wouldn't be allowed anywhere near kids." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had expected anger. He had expected resentment. But hearing those words out loud, it hurt more than he was willing to admit. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Look, I get it. You don't have to trust him yet. You don't even have to like him. But I'll tell you this, he's here, every day, trying." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, Ethan thought she was going to keep arguing. But then, her son tugged at her sleeve. "Mom." She looked down. The boy, maybe 6 years old, was staring at Ethan with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. He fixed the swings. The woman frowned. "What?" The boy pointed. Ethan followed his gaze to the swing set, the very one he had spent an hour repairing the day before. One of the seats had been broken, hanging lopsided and unsafe, until Ethan had replaced the chains. And now, kids were using it again. The woman looked at Ethan, then at the swing, then back at Ethan. Her gaze softened, only slightly. But Ethan noticed it. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her children trailing behind her. She hadn't forgiven him, but she hadn't told him to leave either. And right now, that felt like a win. A man at a crossroads. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment. The silence was loud. He had never thought about what came after. Sure, he had agreed to work at the park. He had agreed to try. But for how long? At some point, he had to move on. Didn't he? His old instincts told him to walk away while he could, to cut his losses and stop trying to be something he wasn't. Because at the end of the day, did he really deserve a second chance? The call that changed everything. His phone rang. Ethan frowned, picking it up. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, until a thought crossed his mind. What if it was Marcus? With a sigh, he answered. "Hello." There was a pause. Then, "Ethan Carter." The voice was calm, steady, professional. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Who's this?" A brief hesitation. "My name is Kelly Monroe," the woman said. "I run the local community center." Ethan frowned. "Okay." There was a beat of silence. Then, "I heard what happened at the park." Ethan's chest tightened. Great. Another person ready to tear him apart. "But then," Kelly continued, "I also heard that you've been showing up, that you've been trying." Ethan stilled. No one had ever acknowledged that before. Not like this. Kelly exhaled. "Listen, we've been running an outreach program for at-risk kids. Some of them come from rough homes. Some of them don't have good role models. And," she hesitated. "And," Ethan prompted, his heart pounding, "and I think you might have something to offer them." Ethan almost dropped his phone. "What?" Kelly sighed. "I'm not saying you're perfect. I'm not saying this erases what happened. But Marcus told me that you used to be good with your hands, that you know how to build things." Ethan frowned. "He told you that?" Kelly chuckled. "He talks about you more than you think." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Kelly's voice softened. "Look, I don't know you, but I do know what it's like for kids who feel like the world's already given up on them. And I think maybe, just maybe, you know what that's like too." Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. Because she was right. Too right. So what do you say? Kelly asked. Ethan stared at the floor. This wasn't what he had planned. This wasn't how his life was supposed to go. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't want to say no. What would I even be doing? He asked. Teaching kids how to build things, Kelly replied. Fix things, work with their hands, give them a skill they can be proud of. Ethan swallowed hard. His hands curled into fists. Because once upon a time, he had been that kid. The one who built things. The one who wanted to be proud of something. And if he could help just one of them. Maybe this second chance was worth taking after all. Finally, in a voice that barely sounded like his own, Ethan said, "Okay, I'll do it." Kelly smiled. "Good. Welcome to the real work, Ethan Carter." The redemption of Ethan Carter. A new beginning. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the community center, staring at the large glass doors like they might swallow him whole. He had agreed to this. He had said yes. And yet, every muscle in his body told him to turn around and walk away. This isn't you. You're wasting your time. No one will ever really forgive you. Old voices, familiar voices, the voices that had kept him trapped in his own bitterness for years. But today, Ethan Carter ignored them. With a deep breath, he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The first lesson. The community center was buzzing with life. Kids, some barely 10 years old, some in their teens, moved in and out of classrooms, their voices a mix of excitement and nervousness. Ethan hadn't been in a place like this since high school, since the days when he was just another lost kid, trying to survive. A woman approached him, a tall, confident-looking black woman with short curls and a warm but sharp gaze. "Mr. Carter." Ethan straightened. "Yeah." She extended a hand. "Kelly Monroe. Thanks for coming." Ethan hesitated for only a second before shaking her hand. "Yeah. No problem." Kelly raised an eyebrow. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." Ethan huffed a small laugh. "Not gonna lie, kinda." To his surprise, Kelly grinned. "Good," she said. "Means you understand how these kids feel." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Kelly gestured toward a group of 5 boys and 2 girls sitting at a table near the back. "Meet your students," she said. Ethan blinked. "Mine." Kelly nodded. "You're teaching them. Right now. So, go." Ethan's stomach dropped. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know how to teach anyone anything. He barely knew how to keep his own life together. But then, one of the boys, maybe 13, glanced at Ethan with a look he knew all too well. Suspicion. Caution. Like he was expecting Ethan to disappoint him. And suddenly, Ethan made a choice. He stepped forward. "All right, listen up," he said. "I'm not a teacher. I'm not a mentor. And I definitely don't have some inspiring speech to give you." The kids stared at him. "But what I do know," Ethan continued, "is how to build things. And I know that when your hands are busy, your mind has a little less room for all the crap weighing it down." That got their attention. "Today we're building birdhouses," Ethan said, pointing at the pile of wooden planks and nails stacked on the table. The kids groaned. "That's lame," one of the boys muttered. Ethan smirked. "Yeah. Think you can do better." The boy straightened. "I know I can." Ethan tossed him a hammer. "Prove it. Something to be proud of." Within 15 minutes, the entire group was engaged. Ethan moved around the table, helping with measurements, fixing crooked nails, showing them how to stabilize the planks. And for the first time in years, he felt useful. Not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as something else. As someone who could actually do some good. By the time the session ended, one of the girls, a shy 12-year-old with long braids, looked up at him. "Are you coming back next week?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I am." And he meant it. Marcus's truth, That night, Ethan sat in the park, watching the sunset, when Marcus walked up beside him. "You showed up," Marcus said simply. Ethan huffed a laugh. "Yeah, I guess I did." There was a pause. Then, Marcus did something unexpected. He sat down beside him. Ethan glanced at him. "What? No lecture today?" Marcus smirked. "You think I like lecturing?" Ethan shrugged. "Kinda seems like your thing." Marcus chuckled but didn't argue. Instead, his expression turned serious. "There's something you should know," he said. Ethan frowned. "What?" Marcus exhaled. "I used to be you." Ethan blinked. "What?" Marcus stared at the horizon. "Not the exact same," he admitted, "but I used to be angry, lost, full of hate for things I didn't understand." Ethan couldn't picture it. Marcus was strong, yes, but cruel, bitter, no way. But Marcus continued. "When Aaliyah's mother left, I had a choice. I could either become a man she'd be ashamed of, or a man she'd be proud of." Ethan swallowed hard. Marcus turned to him. "You made a mistake, Ethan, a big one. But the only thing that matters now is whether you let it define you." Ethan looked away. Could he really change? Did he even know how? Marcus stood up, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're doing better than you think," he said. Then, without another word, he walked away. Ethan sat there, staring at the fading light. And for the first time in his entire life, he believed, just maybe, he wasn't a lost cause after all. The community decides. The next weekend, Ethan showed up to the park, expecting more judgment, more cold stares, more whispers. Instead, he found something different. People were watching him, but not with hatred, not with fear, with curiosity, with caution, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of hope. Aaliyah wheeled up beside him, her hands resting on her lap. "You nervous?" she asked. Ethan smirked. "Nah, just thinking." "About what?" Ethan glanced at her. "About how weird life is." Aaliyah grinned. "Yeah, but weird can be good too." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, I guess it can." At that moment, Kelly approached them, holding a clipboard. "All right, Carter," she said. "Ready for another round of teaching?" Ethan smirked. "You know what? I think I am." And with that, Ethan Carter walked forward, not as the man he used to be, not as the villain people once saw, but as a man who had finally, after all these years, chosen a different path. And that made all the difference. A future rewritten. The final test. Months passed. What had started as a reluctant promise to show up at the park had turned into something Ethan never expected. A routine, a purpose, a life. He was no longer just the man who had broken a wheelchair in anger. He had become a fixture in the community. People who once avoided him now greeted him with nods, hesitant smiles, even small conversations. He was no longer an outsider, but there was still one more test. A test he wasn't sure he was ready for, and it came sooner than he expected. A face from the past. It was a Friday afternoon when Ethan's past finally caught up with him. He was at the community center, finishing a lesson on woodworking with the kids, when Kelly walked in, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she said, folding her arms. "There's someone here to see you." Ethan frowned. "Who?" Kelly hesitated. Then she stepped aside, and Ethan felt the ground drop beneath him. Standing in the doorway was his father, the man who had shaped him, the man who had broken him, the man he had spent his whole life trying to escape. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then his father spoke. "I heard you're doing good things," the older man said. His voice was hoarse, aged with time and regret. "Didn't expect that." Ethan clenched his fists. The room around him faded away. All he could see was the man who had spent years telling him he was worthless. And now he wanted to. What? Talk. "Why are you here?" Ethan finally asked, his voice cold. His father sighed. "I made mistakes." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Mistakes? That's what you call it." His father didn't argue, didn't make excuses. He simply nodded. "I know I wasn't a good father," he admitted, "but I wanted to see if there's anything left." Ethan stared at him, and for the first time in his life, he saw not a monster, but a man. A flawed, broken, human man. And maybe that was enough. The choice that changed everything. Ethan didn't say anything for a long time. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted. His father nodded. "I don't expect you to." Another beat of silence. Then, Ethan sighed. "But if you really want to change." He looked his father in the eye. "Then prove it." His father stilled. Then, he nodded. Ethan didn't know if this was the start of something. Didn't know if he and his father would ever be okay. But at least, it wasn't the end. And that was more than he had ever expected. The final goodbye. That evening, Ethan returned to the park where it all began. The sun was setting, casting the playground in hues of orange and gold. He found Aaliyah near the butterfly garden, her wheelchair parked beside Marcus as they watched the sky. Ethan hesitated. Then, he sat beside them. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, Aaliyah turned to him. "You okay?" Ethan smiled. A real one. "Yeah, I think I am." Aaliyah grinned. "Good," she said, "because you still suck at sweeping." Ethan barked out a laugh. "Unbelievable. I fix a whole park, and you're still on about that." Aaliyah giggled. "Gotta keep you humble." Ethan shook his head, but there was warmth in his chest, a warmth that told him this was home now. Marcus cleared his throat. "So, you staying?" Ethan looked at him, at the man who had saved him without even realizing it, at the girl who had shown him forgiveness when he didn't deserve it, at the community that had given him something he had never had before, hope. Ethan smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." And as the last light of the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Ethan Carter finally let go of the man he used to be and stepped fully into the man he had chosen to become.